story of what we know as the widow's mite. The story of the widow's mite is one that we love and we know very, very well, which is why it behooves us to take a moment to look again at what is being taught to us in this story, in this illustration that Mark has Jesus lift up. Now, I wanted to share with you 3 historical contextual pieces, and I want to do it kind of quickly. So take notes, turn up your ears, because I think it helps us a bit. The first thing is the nature of the specific kind of widow that this story is using as the illustration. There are basically 3 categories of widows that were treated under the law of the Hebrew law or of Israel. Okay? 3 kinds of widows covered under the law. The first one is the widow whose husband has died and he has a brother who is marriageable, which is pretty much anybody. Okay? Now, under the law, if the husband dies and he has a brother, Harry, do you have a brother? Okay, so you die, Nancy, under the law, the brother would have to marry her. So that'd be great. Can you imagine what that would have been like in that time? Because the law was, remember, women were not their own agency. They weren't people under the law. They didn't have rights. They were property. Okay, so under the Hebrew law, as well as Roman law, women were property. So if you want your property taken care of, she kind of comes along with the household and the land and everything else that the brother would inherit to keep the land in the patriarchal family line. So she comes along with it. He might not be none too pleased either, but he's responsible for your upkeep after that. Okay? The second kind of widow is the widow whose husband has no brothers, but they have a son. Only sons, only men could inherit the properties and land. So it's okay if there's no brother, because she is a widow. If he's really young, would have custodial responsibilities about all the property until he was of age to do that for himself. And he is obliged under the law to take care of his mother in her old age. But the third kind of widow was not covered under the law. And this is the widow whose husband has no brothers, and they have had no male heir. And Naomi and Ruth, for example, find themselves in that category. And Jesus, that's the term in Greek that is applied to a woman who we're talking about in the temple, who's given a mite. They are considered poor widows, the ones who have no male representative in their family to take care of them. They are completely, utterly destitute, and in the economic pyramid system of the time, they were completely marginalized. There was nothing that the state had in terms of law to cover for them. The only thing that the law said about these people and any orphans who were parentless were that God would provide for them. They're God's responsibility. Because God said he likes widows and orphans, so we're giving them to him. And that's kind of what the law said. And there's nothing really formal in place to provide for them, other than that other people might kind of see them hanging around and give them something. But they're not necessarily obliged to do that. It's this one idea in the law, which is giving alms. And here's what I love. It's not necessarily the law is saying, give alms because that's the right thing to do. The law says to the wealthy, you should give alms because that can serve as an expiation of your sins. Giving alms kind of gets you that get out of jail free card thing. So it's still about the person doing the giving. It's not a motivation of compassion, it's absolute self-interest. Okay? So if they feel like they might have been extra, not good, they might give you some alms. So their benevolence depends on their sin. Huh? Doesn't work too well, especially when you're surrounded by people, men, who don't really think they do much wrong. So you're not going to get much of anything. I mean, that's just not Now that's the first thing. The second thing is that a little bit about the geographical nature of the layout of the temple that sets this scene. There are 3 major courts, each section of the temple court, broad court system that you would walk into through a series of gates. You come through the first gate, and only Hebrew people can come in beyond that first gate. You get to the next one. The next court was called the women's court. Not because that's only where women could be, but actually everybody could be there who was Jewish. Because the next gate was called the court of Israel, and only men could go through that. You're getting closer and closer to the Holy of Holies. Ultimately, only the high priest gets to enter that. Okay? Now, the women's court then is the place where the public of Israel is. That's really the marketplace system of the temple. It's where a lot of the exchange, getting money, getting sacrifices and things like that is happening in this. It's also where the treasury is kept. What's the treasury look like? Well, we don't have that in the archaeological record terribly well. We only have what was written down about the nature of the treasury much later after the temple was destroyed by the Romans. But in the writing, it sounds like the treasury was located under sort of a balustrade of pillars. The court itself is kind of open, but off the sides, pillars kind of create a little bit of covering, where there were about 11 to 12 chests of some type. And there was attached to them, or maybe they were shaped this way, it's not clear, but they were kind of had something associated with them that was like a funnel or a trumpet. They were called shofaroth. Shofars are the animal horns that are blown at the time of prayer. So we know that they're horn-shaped. Again, whether that's the vessel itself or the mechanism by which it's funneled down into the chest, we're not sure. But we do know that they were made out of brass. And what happens is, when you come along with metal coin, because that's the only kind of currency is metal coins, and you chuck these into these brass tubes. It's intended so that no one can reach down and take money out. You just throw money in. But that would make a lot of noise. So you're throwing your metal money into these brass tubes, and the chest acts as a resonance chamber, and everybody knows you're doing it. Especially since it's over this little bit of an overhang. And it's beautiful. And that's what Jesus is referring to later when he talks about how Pharisees like to walk around and kind of have everybody hear that they're giving money because they trumpet it. That's what that's about. And they literally make as much noise as possible, drawing in their money. And it echoes throughout the court. But this widow comes along, this poor widow, and she throws in 2 little coins, and that's why everybody can hear what she made. A little tink, tink. And the whole place knows. Now, the third thing I want you to be aware of is that throughout the entire evolution of the kingship system of the house of David, 2 things. The first is that there was as the kind of idea of a kingly court system emerged as a social system, and they lifted up Solomon and David, there was at the same time a struggle going on between the law as oral history and the law that became written down. And the general aspect is that when everything was oral history about how things should be done and what's pleasing to God and how we ought to live our lives, then the people who memorized that, the prophets, could also sort of make a commentary on that. How does this apply? They were both the memorizers, the people who would reflect and offer a contemporary exposition about how it would apply, and if needed, because they were the interpreters, they could make a little change, so that the law becomes the way that the society is transformed. The way things go, society transforms along with its understanding of God's will. But as things become more and more associated with the courts, and law becomes more and more written down by scribes who begin to say what the kings and the court system tells them to say, and the interpretations that uphold the system that's good for them, then the more and more prophets are not seen as very infallible. But in fact, the authority rests in the book, in the law, and specifically the way that the status quo says the law reflects the will of God. But whose will is that really? When it is continuing a system that marginalizes the poorest of the poor and becomes itself that mechanism which inflicts injustice. So now, Jesus walks into this particular court, the courts of women in the temple complex. It's also where the treasury is. This is where this story happens. He's already sort of told several stories that are critiques of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and now the scribes. Because the scribes, when he says they burn down widows' houses, is because the way that they are interpreting the law, so that the nobility can claim the land of women who have no men to speak on their behalf. Filling whose coffers? Not the poor. It's the scribes who he's picking out now, who are the ones that want to be seen as noble, and yet enact unjust laws that govern us, while saying laws that mean nothing. So that's the critique there. Now, the scribes, the Sadducees, the Pharisees are all walking around the temple complex as well. It's not like he's saying it quietly. He's openly offering a prophetic critique and claiming in the role of prophet the larger critique of the status quo. Very challenging stuff. The reason he's lifting up this poor widow is also another meaning, I think, which is this all happens as he has come into Jerusalem for the last times, right? This is when they traveled from the Valley of Jordan and they're here in Jerusalem with a specific intent. This is all leading up to the crescendo of his life. And in this moment, he says about this widow, she has given all that she had. Quite literally, in Greek, it translates to mean she has given her whole life. Now, if you do the interpretation of the law, which says she need not worry because God will take care of her, because society won't, then what she's doing is also a tremendous act of faith in an unjust system that has kept her in this way. She has a faith that the system does not. She gives her very life to God in that gesture. It foreshadows and would have resonated deeply with Jesus, who was about to give his whole life also. If giving alms was understood in the law as a way for wealthy people to expiate their sins, how much more has she given when she has given her whole life? How much more is she forgiven? And why does Jesus choose to give his whole life? As a final offering, such that no one need ever trouble or worry again about making offerings for their sin, because their sins are forgiven. If the widow's sins are forgiven, if the sins of the alienated, rejected, and marginalized are forgiven, then there is no judgment that we could ever make to say that they are not worthy of God's love and our love, God's care and our care, God's awareness and our awareness. The trumpet that rings is for our attention. Where in our world, our society, our globe, in the way our economy works, who is it that only can have a life because they depend on our healing they have and of what they are giving. Whether we buy cocoa or coffee, the clothes we wear, the oil we buy, the way our global economy works, what are we taking? What are we consuming? And whose rights are being given for that matter?